timely conversation we have now. So, as mentioned, in this segment, we'll be focusing on the best of both worlds, becoming a global organization. And of course, we've been hearing the term global for a while now, but it has really taken on a whole entire new meaning following the COVID-19 pandemic. The future of work is now becoming increasingly multi-layered. We have seen technology take center stage. Skills that are already in shortage will continue to surge. Job redesign is underway. And the COVID-19 pandemic has completely redefined the way we work. The remote hybrid model seems here to stay. I recently ran some research, and 89% of employees across generations say that that is the way going forward. So this poses for employers obviously both a challenge and also an opportunity. How can organizations evolve their human capital strategy in this new economy, and what can they do to become truly global organizations? I have two incredible experts here today, Nadiah from Malaysia and Rick, who flew in all the way from Chicago to join us. So I'm really excited to explore this topic and see their perspective. So what I wanted to start with is just a quick question. I wanted to ask all of you, and if you can please raise your hand, also in the audience, if you think the answer is yes. Well, actually, I'll ask for a raise of hand, but do you think that the access to global talent is proven to be easier for companies, or has it made the entire talent acquisition process more complex? So this new access to global talent, has it made things easier or more difficult? So who thinks that it made things easier? Okay, Rick. And who thinks it made things more complicated? Nadiah. All right, so perhaps this is a really good place to start. Why? Why, Rick, has it made it easier?
Well, I think that one, looking at accessing the best talent around the world gives a lot more flexibility to employers. So thinking about it from an entrepreneurial perspective, I want to make sure that I'm hiring the best talent that's going to allow me to really expand my business so that I can really focus on creating the best business out there. So now that I'm now looking at talent from not just in my postal code or where I have offices, but now I can actually source the best talent around the world, my thought process has changed. I'm now looking at, hey, this is the best developer, this is the best HR individual, this is the best salesperson that's going to really allow me to expand my business. That flexibility has just changed the dynamic of our organization. I remember, and I said this earlier in one of my speaking engagements, that when I was hiring employees in my zip code, it was great. It was the brick and mortar of what we had to do. But now that I can actually hire talent around the world, I've just seen how that's changed the organization. It's allowed that diversity, which I think is really important to the success of an organization, to allow me to really bring on and expand my business. My business has been able to triple over the years because I've been able to have that diversity of thought in hiring that talent around the world.
Oh, wow. So, I mean, that seems like the ideal scenario, but of course it does come with its own challenges, right? It's not always as easy as it seems. Nadiah, what's your take on this?
Okay, so I just wanted to be provocative. I mean, well, I do believe it makes it easy, accessible to talent. Unfortunately, from a perspective of a local, employer, it gets very complicated. Why? Because number one, because of the mobility of talent, we are facing a lot more complexes and challenges in getting the best talent, because when you are sitting next to Singapore, and you all know Malaysian currency is not as strong as Singapore, it does make it so complex and challenging because you see movement of talent to the higher economy. Although at the same time, we do see a movement of lower economies talent into our country. But the question is also, there is the complication of local, I would say, government regulations where you want to focus on local talent. So let me just give an example. So the latest statistics, take Malaysia, for example, we've seen a 4 to 5% increase in graduates. I'm just talking about just graduate employability. And we've been asked as employers, especially when you're government-linked companies, to prioritize our local talent. I mean, I guess it's not being selfish. You do have to take care of your own talent. And therefore, you have this, difficult situation where I can take a foreign talent who are more capable, but then at the same time, I do have that national service, if I can use that word, to ensure that we do take care of our own local talent. So that's why I said it is challenging, but we can talk a little bit more as we go on later. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? I think we always want to make sure that we're looking at, especially with government regulations, we're very focused on homegrown talent, figure out how we can balance that as well. But I think that's where remote work can come in. It's not like necessarily bringing talent into in the particular country, but it's giving the flexibility of finding talent around the world. And we find that there's statistics that show that companies who have global talent, it actually helps on the domestic talent as well, because they're creating jobs and creating opportunities for where the headquarters of those organizations have been. So we find that I actually just had this with another client a couple of days ago. They started their organization in Hong Kong. That's their headquarters. But now that they're focusing globally, they are still hiring 2-to-1 outside of the country. They're hiring 2-to-1 in Hong Kong, but still hiring outside. But they're actually creating more jobs because of the success they've had outside of Hong Kong as well.
And I guess, Rachele, if I can just add on to that, I think it also gives an opportunity where we need to be more creative, right? Because for a company like Setia, we have companies in Vietnam, shareholder for Battersea Power Station in London. We've got companies in Australia and Singapore. The question is, we need to be creative in influencing decisions at industry level. For example, I'm a Malaysian Employees Federation Council member, and we say, okay, look, how can we take advantage of the mobility of the talent and yet at the same time keep the balance of making sure that you're looking at the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 kind of talent. I have to say, being selfish as an organization, you want to have the best talent all the time, but competing with a global talent when accessibility is so easy, it really stresses on HR. Well, in a way, looking at it positively, I do think that gives us that leeway to think out of the box and think about other ways of making sure that we engage and retain the talent differently. And I guess the other point is about EVP, your employees value proposition. So what is it that you're driving? What is it unique about the organization?
And that's a great question, Nadiah. I actually want to come back to that in a second, because I think EVP and how companies need to rethink their culture and their employer value proposition post-COVID obviously is going to change. But I wanted to go back for a second because obviously there is this talk about recruiting global talent. So the question then here is, what's great about global talent? What's great about local talent? Why is it that we want to look at both? What are the main differences in competencies, for example? We know from one perspective that there is a shortage of certain skills, specifically certain degrees or certain areas. And then for those, you would have to go outside of the market to hire the right talent. But what do you see? I mean, as an Asian organization, what is the strength of local talent versus global talent, and how can you integrate the two?
Okay, I'm speaking from also my own experience. I've worked for about 30 years, 23 years in multinational, and in between, local and city. We like to think that we're a local talent going global. I do think from a HR perspective or even a leadership perspective, you do need a good mix of 60-40 maybe, or 70-30, whatever mix it is, depending on the company. There are pros and cons. I think when you have foreign talent, you bring in different perspective, you bring in a flavor of diversity, which is actually important, because if you don't have diversity, you might go on being very homogeneous and you'll be out of the grid. You do need local talent to have that local context, because depending on industry, for example, in our industry, we build houses. I would say the majority of our customer base is local. And so you really need to understand the local habits, local lifestyles, and so on. So that helps, because especially so in Asia, I don't know, Rachele, you've been here in Singapore, you've been everywhere. But I'm sure in Asia, we're very, very into what's the unique thing about being local. So I think that should be a good mix, a good balance.
So talking about balance, actually, I wanted to ask you, Rick. So Dilhan, the CEO of Temasek International, a very strong local organization, recently mentioned the importance of having a local workforce, however, augmented with global talent. What's your take on this? And what is a good balance to consider? And then how can companies actually strike that balance?
Yeah, so I think the term that I like to use, and I know that we're using it here, is global. You got to be global, but you got to be local. I think your focus on localization is going to be really important. Tying to your clientele, tying to your employee, making sure that they understand that culture is really important from that perspective. You don't want to lose that essence. One thing that we do as an organization is we say that we don't want to be this American company doing it the American way. We want to be a global organization where we're global, but we want to make sure that we're respecting and honoring the cultures that we're employing our talent in as well, and supporting our clients in as well. I think it's important. Diversity is going to be one of those key components of that. I can't get back. I keep getting back to that as why that's important. Diversity of thought is really important. Diversity of culture and language, especially when you look at metropolitans like Singapore. There's huge diversity here as well. And I think that if you're looking to really make sure that you bring in the right talent, you've got to look at that from a global perspective.
Yeah, and I think you're making a really good point when you're talking about diversity of culture. And of course, we know now that diversity is the key to organization success. But sometimes it can also be a challenge, right? Because on one hand, it covers a lot of blind spot in decision making. You bring in a lot of different perspectives. But sometimes, especially if there's a cultural clash, getting people, with different perspectives, point of views, to work together can be a bit challenging. So one thing I wanted to ask Nadiah, because I know you have tons of experience, and after 23 years working in MNCs and now a local Asian company, you've probably seen it all, but how do you integrate local and global talent and really help them work together collaboratively and effectively? For example, also perhaps locals or local talent that has overseas experience, that has built certain capabilities, certain mindsets, perhaps are more comfortable with expressing their opinions. I know one of the things in Asia that is often a challenge for organizations is really getting local talent to step up, because it's very cultural to kind of follow that hierarchy, and especially younger talent maybe be a little quieter. And so this is a significant challenge for companies that can't have the bench strength locally, and at the same time realize that the success of our business, of our local business, depends on our local people. So how can you actually leverage the global versus the local, and also how can you overcome some of the challenges that come with a difference in perspective, different in ways of doing things, and communicating as well?
Okay, I think let's face it, whilst we talk about local versus foreign, we are really living in an era where everywhere else in every country we're becoming quite a global country anywhere we go, because it's almost a melting pot of all kinds of citizens. I mean, Singapore obviously is very much into that. Malaysia, we have so many shared services. I remember when I was in Experian, it's a development center, and we have, Iranian, we have people from India, we have people from everywhere, plus the local talent. I think what's important is to have that engagement activities that actually connect and stitch together people. So, for example, the very basic thing is to really trying to get everyone understand and really assimilate the different cultures. Even though you have a foreigner in your own country, there's this respect to understand the other person's culture. So you have cultural parties and so on, and talked about it. That's just down at the very basic level. But I think at the more intellectual level is to have it's sort of a DI kind of a discussion and dialogue, and even training. Sometimes we take it for granted. In Malaysia, we say naturally we're so used to cultural differences because we have the Indians and Chinese and Malays and so on. I myself am married to a Malaysian. I'm Chinese Malaysian, and so my kids are like, I don't know, they're like completely mixed. And Rachele, there's another layer. You're not just talking about local talent versus foreign talent. You also have local talent who has worked overseas,
Exactly.
or who has been educated overseas. Now, they do come back with very different style, very different thinking. So that's another layer that you're talking about, right? Just take my son just graduated and he's working in London. He's just started. I probably getting his first paycheck this week. Just talking about coming back to the country, he has different perspectives because being away for 4 years in the UK, being exposed to the global community, he has certain expectations. And in reality, I must say, when you come into an organization where it's multinational, that's fine because so used to having 70 nationalities. I was in Nestle, BAT. You go to Vevey, in that whole building of HQ, 76 nationalities. It's quite common, but many of the local companies, large local companies, are starting to scale up. So here, for example, we have not so many, but some foreign employees as well. We do understand there is that respect that we have and the advantages of being diverse in thinking.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And actually, there's a lot of competition, actually, exactly for local talent that has experience abroad, because I guess those could be considered cuspers, right? I understand both worlds. And so it's easier for me to integrate with the local reality, but at the same time, bring back what I've learned and know how to actually make it settle within the local market. In fact, there's quite a lot of organizations now that are putting a huge focus on bringing back talent that is local but working abroad. Now, I would like to ask a question to the audience. Now, the big question is the question of hybrid and remote. And I would like to ask you, how many of you, like realistically and honestly, have considered the possibility of moving to an entire new city or an entire new country following the COVID-19 pandemic and remote work? So how many of you have actually thought about, I could be working anywhere, maybe I should be moving? Anyone? Yes? All right, so one thing that's actually quite interesting, and Rick, I want to pick your brain on this, is I've been running some studies. One of them is the 2022 post-pandemic workplace study to understand the impact of the pandemic on different generations across different industry. And one of the strongest impact of the pandemic is the fact that baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z alike, say that they're now considering or they're thinking about moving, and that's how the pandemic changed their relationship to their employer. But it isn't always as simple as it sounds. While it's true that businesses can now leverage local talent to increase their talent pools, things are a bit complicated. I don't know how many of you have read in the news Google, Facebook, Twitter, Dropbox, and a host of other Silicon Valley companies at the beginning of the pandemic and towards the tail end of it, talking about how if their employees move out of pricey cities, all of a sudden their salary should be cut to 25%. And in response to that, you had other companies saying, you know what, it doesn't matter, you can live anywhere you want and we'll pay you as if you lived in Silicon Valley. So there's obviously, organizations that are trying to take a stand on it. But if we look overall, it really seems that there is a battle discriminating against remote workers, especially when it comes to salaries. So I wanted to get the perspective of Rick, because I know you support a number of different organizations, and exactly in their effort to go local. There's a lot of operational challenges, I guess, that comes with allowing your employees to work from anywhere. So location agnostic pay comes with plenty of risks, as it also means companies will not have cost benefits of paying lower wages to employees in lower cost locations. So Rick, what is your take on this? Can organizations truly have location agnostic salaries? Is this something that can actually exist? And what does that mean when organizations are hiring talent outside of the actual country in other countries?
So I think that's a two-pronged question, actually, because one thing as HR professionals, we have to make sure that we're being fair and equitable. I think that's really important from that perspective. So the person that lives in Silicon Valley and decides to move to Austin, maybe that's a different conversation, versus someone that maybe lives in London and decides to move to Barcelona.
Yeah.
And so there's a different cost of living from that perspective. And I think as an employer, we have to make sure that we look at that. One thing I do recommend is national benchmarking.
Yes.
From that perspective versus local. Back in the day, we used to do more postal code or city locations. I think national ones are going to be a lot more of the trend that we were going to have to go towards. I think also we have to make sure we understand that that person that lived in Silicon Valley and now moved to Florida, that may be okay. But that person that lived in Silicon Valley and then moved to New Delhi, that same salary does create some type of discrimination for employees, because that person can live like a king in New Delhi versus where they would live in the US. So looking at national benchmarking is going to be really important from that perspective. I do want to jump back at something really quickly that ties into this, is that when you're looking at your global approach, you're absolutely right when you have to look at how is that going to be impacted on the HR perspective. But partnering with organizations like an employer of record does give you that flexibility to kind of figure out what that means. It allows you to be more competitive and allows you to have the data points that you need to be able to do business in that particular country. So how to hire employees, how to make sure you're fully compliant. You're absolutely right that from an HR perspective, that can be a little nuance side to that. But for us, I think it's really important that you partner as an HR professional, partner with people who actually know how to do business in those particular countries. Let them allow you to show you how the flexibility that you can have and give you the flexibility of how to work. You just mentioned earlier employees that are looking to that lived in London but decided to move to Spain, for example, and an employer may not have a legal entity in that particular country. Having an employer of record gives you flexibility to retain that talent. You may want to be able to make there may be some salary adjustments from that perspective, but retaining the talent right now, especially with the war on talent, is very, very important. And employers have to look at more flexibility in different ways they can do to retain that talent, because you're absolutely right. Employees today, they're more focused on what's more important to them, which is their families and and how they can actually in that work-life balance. And working in an office does not always get that opportunity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, I mean, we need to probably address kind of the big elephant in the room, which is this great resignation. Everybody's leaving. And of course, what happened is that the shift from in-person to remote work during the COVID-19 pandemic has made employees across age groups not only feel a bit more disconnected from their organization, but also has made them reevaluate their goals and priorities and lifestyles and so on and so forth. And now flexibility has taken center stage. So you could be the company with the greatest employer brand. You could have had the best employer value proposition. You could have done everything right by your employees. But if all of a sudden you don't offer that flexibility that they need and now got a taste of and don't want to walk away from, you're just going to lose them, right? So my question, I guess, for both of you is, since talent attraction or retention is obviously more important than ever, and it's a big headache for organizations, how do HR leaders build the organization of the future? And I guess that would mean an organization that appeals to the majority of their candidate pool, one that is kind of global and local, one that is human and digital, one that is flexible and connected, one that is diverse and aligned. What can companies do to build that? And more specifically, can you zone in on incentives and benefits models, as well as ways to maintain cultural integration in a more hybrid or even remote workplace?
Maybe I can take that. I mean, and there's great resonations. It's so close to my heart, right? I mean, I've lost quite a number of my good talent, and simply because exactly what you said. You know, you can be of a big brand and so on, but somehow the last 2 years of COVID has actually presented that opportunity for people to realize, hey, hang on, you know, I can have a choice to work from home, to do maybe some e-commerce businesses, or to do whatever I want to do within the reach of my work home area, and yet at the same time get an income. I think the 4 or 5 years ago, we talked about IR 4.0, digital transformation, but I think it became very real in the last 2 years, right? Just to give a story, share a story, I lost one really good talent who's been with me for like 7, 8 years. She delivered her baby in September, and we actually allowed her to work from home because we had another issue, because in the country, the government was having this regulation that, you know, there was a restriction on foreign domestic workers and so on. So that's another layer of issues for all my young women talent, because they can't have domestic help and therefore they have to be at home. So we say, okay, fine, you know, we're very flexible. We say, look, do your work from home. But then when we started coming back to work, it can be quite challenging, because I think there is this absence of void if you're not coming back to office. You know, how do your colleagues relate to you when you're 100% at home? So I think for us as a company, we subscribe to a hybrid model. And so she had to leave because she had also some issues with her baby and so on. So, it was sad, but she decided to move on. And while she's tendering her resignation, serving notice, I said, look, make sure that you keep in touch, because she's a talented lady, right? And so she was just going through and scanning across, and she found a job that is allowing her to work from home 100%. I'm not going to say which company, but the company decided to manage their costs and decided to run the company 100% work from home, and they were selling some of the assets. So for some companies, it helps because they were trying to do some cost optimization, as you say, shut down some spaces and so on, because the workplace has a different meaning altogether, right? So coming back to your second question, as a company, what can we do? So it's just timely because 2 weeks ago, I put in a paper for my nomination and remuneration committee and also to the board. And one of those things we said is, it may be very common to MNCs because I remember when I was in Microsoft 15 years ago, I was already working from home. But for many local companies, especially for my industry, where we have sales galleries, people want to come in and look at the, unit house and so on and feel the product, right? So we still need that. We said, look, I've introduced core hours, and it was quite a strange idea because, everyone wants to be there. You got to be there. But it means you must have an implementation plan. We have about 2,000 plus, and we have all kinds of job families. And it means that I have to identify which job families can apply for this sort of benefits, because I can't have my technical supervisor who's building houses at the site coming in at 10 o'clock. So then comes the question of how do you curate the narratives to make sure that no one's going to say, oh, it's unfair. They are already working in the nice air-conditioned office, and now they have flexibility to work from home. But life is not fair. So as a HR person, I need to be bold and say, look, this is the principle and this is why we're doing that. We also said, look, we have 48 projects. We have offices around the world, around Malaysia. I said, look, even though my one person is based in one location, we're asking that they can be allowed to work in any of the locations so that they don't have to spend 2 hours on the road.
And actually, sorry to interrupt, Nadiah. I wanted to get Rick's take on this because companies are coming up with really cool and innovative ways to get people, or to be able to kind of balance the salary with other perks. I know one international bank, for example, has opened some offices in Malaga, and they're saying that junior bankers can now go and work from there for 6 months. Offering, for example, volunteering or sabbaticals or other things in wherever they want in the world. So what are you seeing? Looking at so many organizations, many of them being in the US, and they're usually quite progressive when it comes to coming up with compensation and benefits and other incentives. What are some cool things that you're seeing company do? And do you think that's gonna work?
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about what we do because we are all over the world, right? We operate in 160 countries, and we have talent all over. We have our offices, which we, brick and mortar. We like people to come into the office. We love that culture, but we realized that we had to have more flexibility from that perspective. So what we've been able to do is we've created online interactions with our staff. We've created our own version of Facebook within our own organization that we use, and we get people to be part of that. We do happy hours with our staff around the world. We do our coffee hours, and we do our town halls. We're very active of working with our staff. But one thing that I'll tell you that what we've done, and I think is very successful, is we implemented what we called our regional model. And our regional model is that we put leadership in every single one of our regions. We supported our staff in those particular time zones. We let them know that they are not dependent on the US, that they were going to make sure that they have the right support, technology in their own time zones. And then we were very focused on making sure that we created that flexibility. We have offices. We would love you to come to the offices, but we also understand that your family is more important. And understanding that flexibility is what allowed us to be more successful. During COVID, or should I say right after COVID, when everyone was going through the Great Resignation, we saw a peak in resignations as well. Once we implemented a number of these programs, our resignation numbers almost went down by 80%.
Wow.
Because we were able to make sure that we had a localized model where we were supporting our staff and really understanding what they need. We constantly do employee surveys, which I think is really important from an HR perspective. Let them have a voice, make sure that they are heard, and not just do a survey and just say, okay, thank you for your input, and walk away from it. Have actionable items that you can input, and then reiterate back to the staff, we heard you, this is what we did. Or if we don't agree with something, why we didn't agree with it and why we didn't implement it. Making sure our employees are at the table, making sure that their voices are heard, that is what keeps employees, keeping them passionate about the organization. It's not always about the benefits and the perks. Because you're absolutely right. Companies like Microsoft, like Salesforce, people are leaving organizations like that, Airbnb, because big brands, great benefits, well, they were the ones that we were all trying to be back in the day, right? But they're leaving organizations because that's not important. 61%, there's a poll that recently went out, 61% of employees say what's more important to them is their work-life balance and their families, more so than the organization and what they get paid. And I think that if we don't wake up as employers, we're never going to realize that. And I think that's why flexibility, flexible ways of working, it's not just contractors, it's figuring out solutions that give the employee to actually live wherever they need to be able. Because at the end of the day, if they're passionate, they love what they're going to do, they're going to be your champion for your organization, no matter what.
Absolutely, and actually, it's quite interesting because also in the same research that I was quoting earlier, there's a very strong correlation between mental health and flexibility. So when I asked the four generations, what the impact was on their flexibility, on their work-life balance, and then how that correlated or translated into mental health impact, those employees that claimed more flexibility, greater work-life balance, had a positive mental health experience coming out of the pandemic. The US, interestingly enough, was the country that performed the worst when it came to both work-life balance and mental health. But there's a very big correlation. So I think it's important for companies to understand that it's better to have them and be productive than not.
Let me add to that. I think what you just said was, you're right, the US is the ones who performed the worst. But that's why a global model, that's why localization, and that's why diversity is important.
Yeah.
So not only just doing what you're used to customly doing in your own country based on your own culture, but understanding and learning from others. And that's what we had to do. Our team here in Asia were the ones that actually helped perpetuate that. And I think that was really important. If we didn't have that diversity, if we didn't have that thought, if we didn't have that employee survey, if we didn't have employees at the table, we would not have been able to do that. And look at the success we had because of that.
So there's a question I have for Nadiah, because this leads to a whole other thing, right? So the big topic, you talked about regional a few times, and the big perennial kind of struggle of global versus local. Do we want to be a global organization? Do you want to be, regionalized? Do you want to be localized? And it seems that, while employees performing the job are increasingly decentralized because of this flexibility that allows them to work from anywhere, multinational companies seem to be moving away actually from the regional local approach to become more global and more centralized approach in order to ensure productivity. So, 10, 15 years ago, every organization was global. Then the focus shifted to let's become regional, increasingly more local. And now it seems like, it's becoming centralized again. So my question for Nadiah is, what is your take on this? What is SP Setia Berhad's take on this? And does centralization, globalization, in fact, lead to greater productivity? And how can organizations become more centralized without actually alienating the local markets or the regions? What does localization really mean, I guess, in this new environment?
So, SP Setia, for the longest time, we used to have this model we call control decentralized, which means we're very much decentralized in many things that we do because, as a property developer, you kind of expand by projects, and depending on the product, we have products that is like a 300,000 ringgit to 8 million ringgit. So it's almost like a different segmentation of your customers. Now, we feel that as we talked about productivity, we're being hammered by the board, shareholders value, cost optimization, how do you enable your processes using technologies, AI, and all those stuff. There must be return to those investment, because when you talk about technology investment, it has to come in through your ratios on productivities and so on. So we're now coming back to centralization, we're not talking about centralization within the country, because obviously for us, we have many different business units in Malaysia, but we have Vietnam, for example, Australia, Singapore. And whilst we say that for every country, they have their own unique local regulations and we have to respect the employment law, but there are common practices that we can centralize. Why? Number one, when you centralize, you scale up the processes because you're actually standardizing. Number two, because when you want to keep your brand status, when you centralize, there is a standard that is put to the brand in the way you respond to a customer complaint, for example, rather than having, fragmented kind of communications, because it does affect the brand. And number three, it means that you allow opportunities for talent to move about, because the more centralized you are, the easier it is for talent to be mobile. So I think there needs to be a balance though, so that you don't lose that entrepreneurship in the business.
Thank you so much. A couple of words, Rick, and then I would really like to open the questions to the floor. I mean, there's so many more that I would like to ask, but I'd like to give an opportunity to our audience to also ask their questions and leverage your time. So, Rick, a couple of words?
Yeah, I think that centralization, I think, is key in certain key components of what you do in a business. But I also think autonomy is the one thing that we have to think about, because typically when organizations go to a regional model, the autonomy still typically lives with the corporate office. But when you create autonomy in certain regions, you actually see that flourish. A lot of statistics show that companies do that, and some of the larger organizations that have had that have been able to grow a lot faster from that perspective. It also allows talent in those particular markets to realize that they have a career opportunity. So when you're looking at a regional model or a model where you've got talent and again, autonomy in those particular markets, I'm now someone that's in Singapore working for an American company, but I know in APAC I have the ability to grow. Versus if it's centralized in the US, I know that the only way that I'm going to get hired is if I'm going to grow is I'm in the US. So centralization can be a benefit for processes and procedures and making sure that things are streamlined across the organization. But when we're looking at talent's got to be able to see something and they have to be able to see a career path. And career path is what keeps people engaged and keep people actually within their employers from that perspective.
Thank you very much. This is really interesting conversation, and I have so many more questions about leadership and how to change the mindset of senior leaders, and but we don't have, unfortunately, that much time. So I wanted to ask the participants here, our attendees, do you have any questions that you would like to ask either Nadiah or Rick? If so, we have a microphone going around. Yes.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much. It was very insightful. So I just had one question. So as we look at a lot of companies, we invest a lot on employee engagement, looking at employee value proposition. But I think what you all clearly mentioned was EVP has sort of changed from looking at certain values like loyalty, looking at values like being engaged to the brand. But I think, like you all said, and just wanted some clarification as well, do you all think as we move forward, it is more of how do we support our employees in that flexible environment, or are we still trying to engage them through the company and get them aligned with our values, get them engaged with activities, or do you think going forward it is more about supporting them as they embark on their own journeys, being more flexible, working from home remotely?
I think here's a question I think you have to ask yourself. Excuse me, as an employer, your company is going to evolve. Most companies have changed post-COVID, and understanding your value proposition is going to be really important. Engaging your employees and asking that. Something that we went through as an exercise. We have our core values, we have our core mission and vision within the organization, but we realize post-COVID we are very different than we were before. So we actually went out and polled our employees. Who do you think we are? Think of our core values, think of our value proposition, think of our mission, and tell us what the organization we have become, what do you see that as? We took all of that feedback, and believe it or not, a lot of the core was the same, but there were some changes that we had to make because the core of the organization said, look, we work for an organization, and this is what we think your value proposition is. This is why we're there. Your passion, your integrity, those are things that we want to be part of. But also, these are two other things that we realized that's just really important. So polling your employees, getting their input, making sure they're at the table, as I mentioned earlier, and figuring out, do your employees' values align with who you are as an organization, and being flexible to making change in some cases. Because sometimes that change, we don't see it as in management. We're here, sometimes we're in the clouds, but employees are telling you who we are as an organization. I think it's important that we listen to that.
Thank you. Great question. We probably have time for one or two more if they're quick. Down there?
Yeah, my question is basically more on...
Could you please hold the mic as up as you can? Yeah, we have a hard time hearing up here. Oh.
Okay, I think this is good.
Yes?
Yeah. I work for a non-profit, no?
Cannot hear. So maybe if you can pull down the mask, just let's try.
So my question is that, I'm a global HR director for a non-profit organization. And when we were struggling with this of global versus local, we came up with the idea. I still don't know how much is it working, but the idea was to segregate all the organization into the roles, which is hybrid, remote, and on-site, right? And these three segregations, in a way, worked well, but it has still created a little bit of inequality wherein we say, it's so blessed to work in an in a role where it is absolutely, remote, right? So, is there any different innovative idea of segregating the organization role-wise that can work more with, equity also? And I know this is the whole gist, but my question is, was this innovative enough to do that, or is it like creating more segregations within the organization?
Sorry, would you mind just repeating the last question? The audio is a bit off here, so we could just the last part. We heard everything else, but maybe closer to.
This is, I don't know, this is working.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah. So my question is what we did, was it innovative enough, or is there a better idea of not segregating the organization role-wise?
Okay.
Yeah, I think if we're on the stage and we say, here's the playbook of how to do it best, I think that's we're kidding ourselves when we say that. I think what you did was actually great. I think it's a great step, but I think that it's not the only step. I think you have to continue to look at that, excuse me, and get feedback from your staff of how that works. You want to make sure you're also not creating any discrimination between remote work, hybrid work, and what that looks like. And you have to put key rules behind that. What does that mean for someone that's remote? Even if they live 5 minutes from the office, can they be remote? I think you have to define that. And I don't think there's no one playbook that works for every organization. I think you have to sit back and think about that from a leadership perspective. I'm happy to have a conversation with you later on that and what we've done in the past. But it's constantly evolving. And when you're having your management meetings, do a temperature check. See, is this actually working? How are employees engaging? Do you currently do employee engagement surveys? Okay. Find out what they think. Find out what employees are thinking. Also ask your management team separately. I always do separate surveys for management and how they feel like it's working as well and how employees are engaged from that perspective.
Can I just add on to that? I think
Just 2 words, Nadiah, because we have to wrap up.
I think that's the structural bit that you're talking about. I think the other thing that you might want to consider is also making sure that leadership is creating that environment, because one, you have the structure, but the leaders who are actually facilitating the work environment and team has to be in the right concept and on the same page as well. Because otherwise, there's a disconnect between what you're trying to introduce and what is really happening.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I don't know about you, but I thought this incredibly interesting. Just one last question I want to ask all of you. How many of you think that going back to the office is the way to go? Hybrid? Fully remote? Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Please, a round of applause for Nadiah and Rick. Really wonderful conversation. I know they will be here for the rest of the day, am I right? So I'm sure that they're more than happy to answer questions, so am I. So yeah, please do reach out to us. And if you have any questions, we're also available on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you, Nadiah.